All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the final module for the semester. This week we'll be discussing civil liberties issues related to Homeland Security. As you read these chapters and articles, please think about the legal foundations of Homeland Security that were covered in the last section, or last module. The issue of civil liberties was touched on in that material, but this week we're really going to kind of get into them. So there's several readings for this week. The first is Martin. He provides a general overview of the civil liberties implications related to Homeland Security. Golden and Chang specifically discuss the Patriot Act. And even though some of the provisions of the Patriot Act have been kind of rolled back because of the Edward Snowden incident, the discussions related to the Patriot Act provide a good discussion of the balance between security and liberty and the effects that a catastrophic event can have on the views of citizens. The Dahl article discusses the debate about whether or not there should be a separate domestic intelligence agency and the security and civil liberties implications of that. And Monahan discusses the role of fusion centers and the security and civil liberties implications of that. One important issue to think about and remember while you're reading and thinking about the material for this week goes back several weeks in the semester when we were talking about definitions. How events are defined, whether terrorism or not, or how people are defined, whether they're an extremist, a terrorist, an activist. All those things have important implications for civil liberties. As legislation and policy is created, it includes definitions for events and people related to Homeland Security. How those are defined impacts whether people and events are included or excluded in the provisions in those acts or laws. For example, being defined as domestic terrorist or domestic extremist would be viewed very differently than as an activist. A domestic terrorist is different from a domestic extremist. And the same person may qualify as any of those three simply based on how those definitions are constructed, and how they are defined can have serious implications for that person's life and liberty. All right, first article I'm going to discuss is Golden. Golden's chapter is very analytical regarding the various provisions of the Patriot Act. I really like his discussion of the security freedom continuum, and I think it provides good context within which to consider the articles for this week. So essentially, in his continuum, as security would increase, freedom would decrease, and vice versa. So he makes a good point that unlimited freedom would most likely result in anarchy, and absolute security would end up in a dictatorship type situation and a police state. Okay, so it's important that you got to have this balance between the two. Another important consideration about the Patriot Act is that this is not the first time that this continuum may have tilted more to security than freedom. So those that are trying to profess that this is a unique expansion of the security state in America, I don't think they're really being that honest. Okay, is it warranted? Well, that's a completely different discussion. All right, but he then does a pretty nice job of discussing the various provisions within the Patriot Act. So those of you that didn't really read it in the last module can get a nice little summary of it here from Golden. It's also interesting how people reacted to the provisions. There was a pretty intense debate at the time, especially after everyone realized what was in the bill. But at the time it was passed, the government was intent on doing something in the wake of 9/11. Right? We have to do something. We just had this catastrophic attack. We can't just not do anything. We have to do something. So the Patriot Act was ratified. And at that time, few people wanted to be known as the person who voted against something that would make America safer in the wake of something like 9/11. Golden references an article by Chang, who's actually the author of the next reading. And then, kind of along the same lines as this debate that was had, the other interesting part of this chapter is how public opinion changed regarding the Patriot Act since the time of its passage. At the time, when it passed, most people believed that the provisions were necessary to protect the homeland. And then as time went on, public opinion started to shift to believe that the government may have overreached when it passed the Patriot Act. All right, the next one is Nancy Chang. Her discussion of the Patriot Act certainly has a different tone than that of Golden. She does a thorough job of highlighting the civil liberties issues with the Patriot Act. And she certainly takes the side of the Patriot Act heavily infringing on people's rights. So as you read this, think about her arguments concerning the various provisions. Are these valid arguments? If so, why? Do you agree with them? But the main reason why I included this article is her discussion in various places about how terms are defined and why that can be problematic. One of the first definitions she highlights is how domestic terrorism is defined and what she perceives as a potential problem with that definition. One of the points she makes is the use of vague and broad terms in the definition. Now remember, Homeland Security policy is often written that way, using broad and vague language, normally to attempt to allow law enforcement and security officials, this kind of leeway and the ability to apply acts or laws to new and dynamic challenges. And the thought is that if statutes are written very narrowly, they will not have the applicability to new challenges and thereby will hinder officers from doing their job. So, is that how things should be written? But again, you might get into some definitional issues when you start talking about vague terms. Okay, so then the sneak and peek section, she talks about the term reasonable. This is like the definition of vague term, right? What's reasonable? What I think is reasonable, you may think is crazy. And what you think is reasonable, I may think is crazy. So how does that impact the execution of law enforcement operations? All right, and then she discusses the term content. Okay, who decides what content is? Or the word relevant. Who decides what is relevant to a criminal investigation or not? And how relevant does it need to be? So I'll kind of end on this last one. We're on page 423. She highlights definitional issues with how Patriot Act defines terrorist activity and terrorist organizations. So a terrorist organization does not have to be designated as such by the government, but can be two or more people who engage in terrorist activities. So then someone could be charged with terrorist activity that included soliciting funds for a group that is not designated as a terrorist organization, but fits the new definition of terrorist organization in section 411. So is it kind of apparent how these definitions could become problematic, right? And could cause issues not only in the enforcement, but also for civil liberties as well. So that's Chang. Okay, the third article is Dahl, and it discusses the debate around whether the U.S. should have a domestic intelligence agency that only focuses on intelligence rather than the FBI that does both law enforcement and intelligence collection. So the first part of his article really just kind of outlines the debate that was had and discusses how the intelligence community in America is organized post 9/11. Dahl argues that the oversight that's built into the new intelligence apparatus is not really sufficient to secure individual liberties. So in essence, he argues that sunset provisions that were included in the Patriot Act were simply just reauthorized in 2011 without any debate or fanfare, and that congressional oversight is sorely lacking, which leads to this situation where the executive branch is essentially overseeing itself, which can certainly be problematic. Okay, you can't have somebody supervising themselves. That just opens the door up to all kinds of problems. So as we learned in the last module, oversight is extremely important to make sure abuses are not occurring. And if those that are supposed to be overseeing intelligence collection are not, then that can certainly provide some serious liberty concerns. The other point he makes that leads into our final article is concerns about state and local fusion centers. Because of the decentralized nature of this part of the intelligence apparatus, there's not nearly as much oversight of those places, even though many of them are funded by federal dollars. All right, the final article is by Monahan. So Monahan discusses fusion centers and the potential for abuses. And this one too can certainly be read as having an ideological slant, but the potential for abuses certainly deserves consideration. One of the first issues identified is one that was identified earlier, is that fusion centers have these kind of open-ended mandates and somewhat ambiguous guidelines. And while again that grants them the ability to be flexible, it could also lead to abuses depending on who is deciding what those guidelines mean and how they're applied, and could lead to fusion centers exceeding their mandate and their mission and function. So we then provide several examples of abuses by fusion centers. And here again, the issue of definitions rears its ugly head. Okay, when you examine these case studies, it becomes very clear that definitions, again, have played an important role in determining who should be subject to surveillance. Another possible issue of fusion centers is the dual roles occupied by members of the fusion center. So when you have a fusion center and the analysts are also police officers or members of the National Guard or have some other kind of some other kind of related occupation, there's always this potential for the blurring of lines between the two. And this can be especially problematic if the rules and accountability measures are different for the two different organizations. All right, we'll stop here for this week. Please be sure to complete your assignments. And as always, please let me know if you have questions.